It was just a few cars, a few friends laughing in the backyard, a completely ordinary Saturday for my 16-year-old son, until the flashing red and blue lights lit up our quiet cul-de-sac. The HOA board president had made a call, not to me, not to ask a question, but to the police, claiming a dangerous, unauthorized gathering was underway. They thought this was about enforcing a petty rule. They thought they had power. They had no idea who was sitting at my picnic table. What happens when you try to flex your authority over the wrong family? We weren't looking for trouble when we moved into the Cypress Creek community. My name is David, and after 20 years of military life, all my wife Sarah and I wanted was a quiet, stable place for our son Liam to finish high school. A normal life. Cypress Creek, with its manicured lawns and friendly wave from neighbors driving by in their golf carts, seemed to promise exactly that. The house was a modest brick front, but the backyard was what sold us. A generous space shaded by old oak trees, perfect for the occasional family barbecue. Liam, a quiet and good-hearted 16-year-old, had struggled to find his footing after so many moves. His passion was history, specifically military history, and he'd finally found a group of friends who shared that interest. They were good kids. They'd study together, play strategy games, and sometimes they'd just sit out back talking. It was the picture of harmless teenage camaraderie. I knew the community had an HOA. I'd signed the paperwork. The rules seemed standard, if a bit exhaustive. Keep your grass below a certain height, no boats or RVs parked in driveways, approved exterior paint colors. It all seemed geared toward maintaining property values, a goal I could understand. The president of the HOA board was a man named Gerald Crockett. He lived 3 houses down, a retiree who treated the neighborhood covenants like his personal constitution. He was always making notes on a clipboard during his evening walks, a silent, surveying presence. We had one minor run-in early on. A week after we moved in, Gerald politely but firmly pointed out that our trash cans were visible from the street on a non-collection day. A simple mistake. We apologized and stored them in the garage. He gave a tight smile and said, "We just like to keep things tidy here. It's what keeps Cypress Creek desirable." There was an edge to his politeness, a hint that his desire for order wasn't just about aesthetics, but control. But we shrugged it off. We were the new family. We wanted to fit in. We had no idea that our desire for a peaceful life was about to collide with Gerald Crockett's need to govern it. And we certainly didn't know that a simple act of teenage friendship would be the spark that lit the fuse. The first official notice arrived in the mail a week after Liam's small gathering. It wasn't an email or a friendly reminder. It was a crisp, formal letter on HOA letterhead, citing a violation of Covenant 12, Section 4, unauthorized congregating of vehicles causing a visual nuisance and potential decrease in property values. A visual nuisance. That's what they called 3 cars parked neatly in our driveway and along the curb directly in front of our house. The fine was $50. We laughed at the absurdity, but a cold knot formed in my stomach. Sarah, ever the diplomat, said, "I'll just go talk to Gerald. It's a misunderstanding." She returned 10 minutes later, her face pale. Gerald hadn't been open to discussion. He'd stood on his pristine porch, clipboard in hand, and recited the rule verbatim. "The rule is clear, Mrs. Evans. Driveways are for resident vehicles only, not for parties." When Sarah pointed out it was just a few friends studying, he'd simply said, "The board determines what constitutes a gathering. Pay the fine and it won't happen again." We paid it. It was easier than fighting. We told Liam his friends needed to park further down the street, around the corner. It was an inconvenience, but we were new. We didn't want to make waves. That was our first mistake. The second notice came 2 weeks later. Covenant 7, Section 1, improper storage of recreational equipment. The equipment in question was a single deflated soccer ball left on the patio after Liam kicked it around with a friend. The fine, $75. This time, I went to see Gerald. I found him meticulously edging his lawn, a task that seemed to bring him immense satisfaction. I kept my voice calm, reasonable. "Gerald, a soccer ball? Isn't this a bit extreme?" He didn't stop edging. "Rules are rules, David. We all agreed to them. It's about standards. Let one slide, and soon the whole neighborhood is storing junk on their patios. It's a slippery slope." His tone was that of a weary king explaining basic governance to a simple peasant. The pettiness was breathtaking. It was no longer about the rules. It was a test of dominance. We paid the second fine under protest. The battle lines were now drawn in the perfectly manicured grass of Cypress Creek. The harassment escalated from bureaucratic to personal. Gerald's evening walks became slower, more deliberate pauses in front of our house. He'd stop and stare, sometimes making a note, sometimes just watching. Liam started feeling uncomfortable, asking if he was in trouble. Our home, our sanctuary, began to feel like it was under surveillance. Then came the third notice. This one was a masterpiece of absurdity. Covenant 18, Section 2, unauthorized flora constituting a non-conforming aesthetic. They had fined us $100 for the potted petunias Sarah had placed on our front steps. The reason? The terracotta pots were not an HOA-approved neutral earth tone. They were, and I quote from the letter, a garish reddish orange. That was the breaking point. I didn't pay the fine. Instead, I requested a formal hearing with the entire HOA board. The meeting was held in Gerald's sterile, beige living room. 3 other board members, all retirees who seemed to view Gerald as their unquestioned leader, sat flanking him. I presented my case. The rules were being interpreted with malicious pettiness, targeting my family. I spoke of the constant surveillance, the intimidation my son felt. Gerald listened with a condescending smile. When I finished, he steepled his fingers. David, no one is being targeted. We are simply upholding the covenants that every homeowner signed. Your consistent violations show a pattern of disregard for our community's standards. If you find the rules too burdensome, perhaps Cypress Creek isn't the right fit for your lifestyle. The threat was veiled but crystal clear. Fall in line or get out. The other board members nodded in solemn agreement. I left that house feeling a fury I hadn't felt since my time in active conflict zones. This was a different kind of war, fought with paperwork and petty tyranny instead of bullets. The next day, a new notice arrived. It wasn't for a fine. It was a cease and desist order regarding excessive and disruptive noise. The cited time was 3:17 p.m. the previous Saturday. Liam had been watching a historical documentary on the living room television at a reasonable volume. Our windows were closed. The only person outside was Gerald Crockett, standing on the sidewalk, his ear subtly turned toward our house. He wasn't just enforcing rules anymore. He was inventing infractions. He was letting us know there was no rule we couldn't be broken for. We were trapped in a game where only he knew the rules, and he was the referee, judge, and jury. The feeling of helplessness was suffocating. We were law-abiding people, and we were being systematically bullied by a man with a clipboard and a God complex. We started researching our legal options, but the process was daunting, expensive, and slow. Meanwhile, Gerald was swift and relentless. The climax of his campaign came on a sunny Saturday afternoon. Liam had a project due for his history class. His topic, the training and ethos of the U.S. Navy SEALs. He'd been interviewing a family friend, a retired SEAL named Marcus, over video chat for weeks. As a surprise, Marcus decided to drive down with 2 of his former teammates to spend the day with Liam, to give him a first-hand account, to show him some training manuals and artifacts. They were heroes to my son, and this was the greatest day of his life. They arrived in a single, nondescript SUV and parked legally along the curb. They were quiet, respectful men in their 50s. We were in the backyard, Liam listening with rapt attention as Marcus shared a story. The scene was one of profound respect and quiet conversation. I saw Gerald slow his car to a crawl as he passed our house. I saw his eyes fix on the SUV, on the unfamiliar faces. I saw the familiar, self-righteous tightening of his jaw. He didn't stop. He just drove on. An hour later, we heard the sirens. Distant at first, then growing louder, closer, until they cut off right outside our home. Through the front window, I saw 2 sheriff's cruisers, lights flashing, blocking the street. My heart hammered against my ribs. What had happened? Was there an accident? A stern knock echoed through the house. I opened the door to find 2 uniformed deputies on my porch. Their hands were resting lightly on their utility belts. "Sir," the lead deputy said, his voice all business. "We received a complaint from the HOA president of a possible disturbance at this residence. He reported a large, unauthorized gathering, suspicious vehicles, and a potential trespassing situation. We need to come in and speak with the occupants." My blood ran cold. He had called the cops, on my 16-year-old son, on a gathering of quiet men sharing stories. Gerald Crockett had finally and irrevocably crossed the line. But as the deputies stepped into my foyer, their eyes scanning the quiet, ordinary living room, a strange calm settled over me. Because standing up from the patio chairs in my backyard, their postures shifting from relaxed to alert in a microsecond, were three men who specialized in dealing with threats. The game was over, and Gerald Crockett had no idea he had just declared war on the wrong house. Here's your passage rewritten exactly the same, with no word changes at all, just cleaned and structured properly for you. The two deputies stepped into my foyer, their presence immediately shrinking the space. Their eyes, trained to assess and detect threat, scanned the quiet living room, the family photos on the wall, the utterly normal scene of domestic life. The lead officer, his nameplate reading Deputy Miller, maintained a professional but stern demeanor. Sir, we need to account for everyone on the property. The complainant stated there was a significant rowdy gathering underway. We'll need to speak with your guests. A cold, precise anger replaced my initial shock. This was it. Gerald Crockett had weaponized the law against my family for the last time. Before I could even form a response, a movement from the backyard caught everyone's attention. The sliding glass door opened silently. Marcus stepped inside first. He didn't stride in aggressively. He simply entered, his posture relaxed yet impossibly upright. His two teammates, Mike and Javier, flanked him slightly, their entry just as quiet and deliberate. They had changed. The relaxed uncles from the backyard were gone. In their place was a focused, silent intensity that filled the room. They didn't say a word. They just stood there, their calm, assessing gazes moving from me to the deputies. The change in the atmosphere was instantaneous and electric. Deputy Miller's partner, a younger officer, instinctively dropped his hand closer to his sidearm, his body tensing at the sudden appearance of three unknown, highly capable-looking men. Deputy Miller, more experienced, held up a subtle hand to his partner. His eyes narrowed, not in aggression, but in recognition. He was seeing something in their bearing, their quiet confidence, that his training told him was significant. "Gentlemen," Miller said, his tone cautious, "can you identify yourselves?" It was then that Liam, his face flushed with a mixture of fear and fierce pride, spoke up from behind them. "They're my guests, officers. That's Marcus, Mike, and Javier. They're retired U.S. Navy SEALs. They're here helping me with a school project on military history." The word SEALs hung in the air, a tangible thing. The younger deputy's eyes went wide. Deputy Miller simply nodded slowly, 1,000 pieces clicking into place. He looked from their steady, unwavering eyes back to me. "Navy SEALs," he repeated flatly. "That's correct, Deputy," Marcus said. His voice was low, calm, and carried a natural authority that required no volume. "We were sharing some stories with young Liam here. I assure you, the only disturbance has been the sirens." I finally found my voice, the dam of my controlled fury breaking. "The complainant is Gerald Crockett, the HOA president. He lives 3 houses down. He has been harassing my family for months over absurd violations. Parked cars, a soccer ball, the color of our flower pots. He called you today because he saw unfamiliar vehicles and decided that gave him the right to disrupt my son's day and waste police resources. This is a targeted campaign of harassment." As I spoke, Deputy Miller's professional mask remained, but I could see the realization dawning in his eyes. He was no longer responding to a call about a disorderly party. He was standing in the middle of a deeply petty neighborhood feud, and he had just been used as a pawn. It was at that exact moment that we all saw him. Gerald Crockett, unable to resist witnessing his victory, had crept to the edge of my lawn. He was peering around the corner of my garage, his clipboard held tight to his chest, a smug, expectant look on his face, waiting to see the perpetrators led away in handcuffs. Deputy Miller saw him too. He held my gaze for a long second, then gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He turned to his partner. "Wait here." He walked out my front door, down the path, and directly toward a suddenly nervous Gerald Crockett. We watched from the doorway. We couldn't hear the words, but we saw the entire theater of it. Miller's posture was rigid, his finger jabbing toward his notepad. Gerald's smugness evaporated, replaced by flustered hand gestures as he tried to explain. He pointed toward our house, his motions growing more frantic. Deputy Miller didn't budge. He leaned in close, his words clearly sharp and final. We saw Gerald's shoulders slump in defeat. The clipboard, his symbol of power, hung limply at his side. Deputy Miller turned and walked back to our porch, leaving a visibly shattered Gerald standing alone on the sidewalk. The humiliation was absolute and public. Miller stopped before me, his expression now one of grim understanding. Mr. Evans, the situation is clear. There is no disturbance here. The call was unfounded. He glanced past me at Marcus, Mike, and Javier, who had remained silent sentinels in my foyer. He gave them a single, respectful nod of acknowledgement. He handed me his card. If you have further issues of this nature, you call me directly. Don't bother with 911. We'll consider this matter resolved. The two deputies got in their cruisers and drove off, leaving no flashing lights, no sirens, just an eerie silence in their wake. Across the street, curtains twitched in neighbors' windows. The spectacle was over. Gerald Crockett stood frozen on the sidewalk, utterly alone, exposed not as a powerful leader, but as a petty tyrant who had just been thoroughly and publicly neutered by the very authority he had tried to summon. The battle was won. The silence after the cruisers left was heavier than the sirens had been. Gerald Crockett remained statue still on the sidewalk for a full minute, a man whose entire worldview had just been dismantled on his own perfectly manicured turf. He didn't look toward our house. He simply turned, shoulders hunched, and walked slowly back to his own, a defeated general retreating from a battlefield of his own making. The clipboard was gone. I later found it discarded in the grass, a symbol of his abdicated power. Back inside, the tension broke. The rigid posture of my SEAL friends relaxed back into their easygoing camaraderie, but the look in their eyes when they turned to me was one of fierce solidarity. Marcus clapped a hand on my shoulder. "David," he said, his voice low and serious. "That is a special kind of crazy. You okay?" In that moment, I was more than okay. I was vindicated. The helpless fury that had been boiling inside me for months had cooled into a solid, unshakable resolve. The spell was broken. Gerald Crockett was no longer a fearsome authority. He was just a sad, petty man who had been exposed in front of the entire neighborhood and the local sheriff's department. The fallout was immediate and profound. The story, of course, spread through Cypress Creek like wildfire. It wasn't through gossip. It was through a series of quiet knocks on our door. Neighbors we'd never really spoken to came by, not with curiosity, but with gratitude. Mrs. Gable from across the street brought a pie. "He fined me for having a non-regulation welcome mat," she confessed, her voice a whisper. "Thank you for standing up to him." The Henderson family down the block, whose teenage daughters loved to play soccer in their own front yard, stopped by. "He threatened us with a sports activity violation," Mr. Henderson said, shaking my hand with a firm grip. "You've given us all a bit of our backbones back." Here we weren't the only victims. We were just the ones who had, entirely by accident, housed the ultimate deterrent. The incident had created a silent coalition of the formerly intimidated. The official consequences for Gerald were swift. The following week, an emergency meeting of the HOA board was called. Not by Gerald, but by the other members. We learned through the neighborhood grapevine that Deputy Miller had followed up with a formal report to his superiors, detailing the misuse of emergency services for a personal vendetta. That report found its way to the HOA management company. Gerald Crockett was unanimously voted out as president. He resigned from the board entirely shortly after. The new president, a younger woman named Elena Torres, who had always found Gerald's reign excessive, instituted a new policy. All complaints required photographic evidence and a written statement from two separate board members before a fine could be issued. The era of one-man rule was over. We never received another fine. The notices for the petunias and the noise violation were formally rescinded with a letter of apology from the new board. The constant, surveillant walks past our house ceased. Gerald became a ghost in his own community, rarely seen outside, his house a quiet monument to fallen pride. But the true impact, the one that mattered most, wasn't about rules or fines. It was about my son. The boys who had been his friends became his brothers. They saw their quiet, history-loving friend backed by real-life titans. The story of the day the SEALs came over became legend in our house and theirs. Liam's confidence, which had been chipped away by Gerald's silent judgment, didn't just return, it soared. He had faced down a bully, not with fists, but with truth and the unwavering support of his family and his heroes. He learned a lesson more valuable than any in his history books: that authority is only legitimate when it's fair, and that standing up for what's right, even when it's terrifying, is what truly defines a person. Marcus, Mike, and Javier, they became permanent fixtures in our lives. They check in on Liam regularly, offering mentorship and guidance that extends far beyond military history. They joke that they're our family's HOA rapid response team. We laugh, but there's a truth to it. Their presence that day was a catalyst that changed everything. So, what's the takeaway from all of this? It's not that you need to be friends with Special Forces operators to win an HOA dispute. That was our unique and, frankly, unbelievable circumstance. The real lesson is about the nature of petty power. People like Gerald Crockett operate in the shadows of ambiguity and fear. They rely on your desire to avoid conflict, your assumption that they have more authority than they do. Their power is a phantom, sustained only by collective compliance. The moment you shine a light on that power, the moment you demand clarity, evidence, and fairness, is the moment it begins to crumble. It requires courage. It requires documenting everything. It requires knowing your rights and the governing documents backwards and forwards. And sometimes it requires finding your allies, because you are almost certainly not the only one they've targeted. We stayed in Cypress Creek. The house now feels like a home, not a monitored compound. The grass is green, the petunias are blooming in their garish terracotta pots, and the sound of friends laughing in our backyard is just that, the sound of laughter, not a violation. Gerald Crockett tried to enforce a rule of fear, but he made a critical error. He underestimated a father's love for his son, and he underestimated the quiet strength of a family that simply wanted to be left in peace. He thought he was calling the cops on a teenage party. What he was really doing was calling the end of his own reign. So, what would you have done if you were in my shoes? How far is too far when it comes to protecting your home?